with a great deal of pleasure that I introduce Dr. Kevin Hamburger. Dr. Hamburger is a clinical psychologist and an associate of the professor of clinical family medicine at the medical school in Wisconsin. He's been a principal investigator of the Kenosha County Department of Social Services Treatment of Domestic Violence Perpetrators Research Program. And he's also on the Domestic Violence Task Force for St. Catherine's Hospital and a member of the Kenosha Domestic Abuse Intervention Project. He's been a contributing editor in the domestic violence movement with some presentations in Family Violence Bulletin, the Journal of Family Violence, the Journal of Interpersonal Violence, and the Violence in Victims. In 1989, he co-edited Treating Men Who Batter, Theory, Practice, and Programs. And then he did a chapter in Violence Education Task Force Monograph. His expertise has been to lecture at various professional gatherings, such as the American Society of Criminology, the Western Psychological Association, the American Academy of Family Physicians, and the Society of Teachers of Family Medicine. He brings an insightful presentation to us, and he has worked with both perpetrators and victims of domestic violence. Dr. Hamburger.
I was real pleased to accept this kind invitation to come to Montana and talk a little bit about my experiences, particularly working with domestically violent men, and also to share some ideas for the future, as Susan mentioned in the morning presentation. A couple of minor corrections, though, to the introduction, kind as it was, and partly my fault probably. I was introduced as being with the Medical School of Wisconsin, or such a thing as that. There actually are two medical schools in Wisconsin. One is the University of Wisconsin Medical School. But I'm with the Medical College of Wisconsin, sometimes affectionately known as MCOW, the other medical school. The other thing is, the Department of Social Services actually does not have a grant study on perpetrators of violence, but that's just medical school politics. When I sent my CV in for them to look at, anybody who's ever been on a faculty, particularly in a medical school, you have to justify your existence to them somehow. And usually in medicine, that's the bottom line, is how much money they make for us. And so on that part, I've got a clinical contract with them, but it kind of, in a roundabout way, fuels some of the program research that I've been able to do over the years. But it's definitely not a grant from them to do that kind of research. They're only paying for treatment. Another reason I'm very happy to be here is I mentioned to several of you that I've met this morning so far, is I have spent, as a youth, several summers coming out to Montana as a tourist. Mostly familiar with the eastern part of Montana, the Glendive and Coshika Park area. And I don't know why that's funny, but we found it to be God's country. It's a little different than Wisconsin. We are always impressed with the big sky country and all that stuff. And so, it was a real pleasure to be able to combine talking about things that I do for a living and some thoughts I have with coming to a place and being able to share it with my family now. A place that I thought was, I don't know if I call it paradise. We think of Wisconsin paradise, but awful darn nice. So I'm happy to be here. I wanted to just make one comment to kind of extend something that I heard Susan say this morning, and then I want to get into what I want to talk about, what I came here to talk about. And that was the invisibility of women in newspaper accounts. And I was real moved by that particular account that you had made earlier. I'd like to say that we need to point those issues out when they happen. But the other side of that is we also need to take the effort and the time to point out when good things happen as well. And I did not and I thought about bringing this particular newspaper article as an example of how we need to get and how we need to reinforce other components of the system when they do the good things that we'd like them to do as well. But I can at least share the recollection of the article. It was in the Milwaukee Journal a maybe about 5 months ago now, a man was sentenced to prison for 70 years. He will not be eligible for parole for 70 years for killing his wife. And in the process, the judge was quoted in the newspaper as telling him that he's sick and tired of seeing men come before him thinking they own their wives and that they can do anything they want to him. He's going to put this man away forever. And I was so moved by that particular newspaper article that I had to write this judge a letter, because I believe that judges oftentimes, as the police, as battered women's advocates, and as workers with perpetrators, batterers, that we often feel incredibly isolated in the work that we do. We don't get a lot of positive feedback. We see life oftentimes at its worst, in its most crisis-ridden stages, and sometimes, at least in my work, I never get a thank you from people for the work I do. And oftentimes I feel that it's not enough as well, what I do. So maybe I don't deserve a thank you. But I certainly think when we see good things happen, we should also pat each other on the back. And that, I think, is how we begin to build these networks that Susan has talked about and that I'm told to talk about as well. Now, if I were a preacher, and I was doing a sermon today, I think a couple of things would be self-evident. First, this would be a fairly long sermon. But the theme of that sermon would be, we can't do this alone. We have to do this together. And that's what I want to focus on today. And I'm going to do this in a slightly different way, coming at it from the angle of dealing with the perpetrator. And I'm going to go back a little bit, as Susan did as well, and review some of the history very briefly, talk about the state of knowledge kinds of issues, and then project into the future. And along the way, I'll be also projecting into the future too. I'm coming at this partly from the perspective of a researcher, since I do work in an academic setting to a point, and I'm sort of compulsive, and I like to look at data and see what's happening and how things work and so on. And so I'm going to be reviewing some studies and sort of basing some of my ideas on that. Now, for those of you who don't look at yourself as researchers as much as service providers, I don't want you to feel put off by this, because one of the things that I believe very strongly in this entire field of domestic violence, woman abuse, is that some of the best research really can come out of small service-oriented programs. And I don't think we have to wait around for university-based ivory tower kinds of things to come filter down to us before it makes any sense. I think part of the idea of even doing research in smaller cities and smaller programs is to develop accountability of our own programs. How are we doing? Not just how is the whole field doing, but how are we doing in this particular community? So I think some of the suggestions I'm going to make may have some relevance as well to all of us here. As has been talked about, society has generally not viewed domestic violence or woman abuse as a crime. It's been glossed over in many ways. Police not arresting unless there were incredibly severe injuries to battered women. Prosecutors being very reluctant to prosecute in cases of woman abuse. In an early study paper by Eisenberg and Miklo, actually it was a study, a qualitative study, where they interviewed different criminal justice personnel. They quoted an assistant district attorney as saying what prosecutor would want to base their career on prosecuting domestic disputes. So it's trivialized historically. Judges often handing down trivial sentences. When I first started working in the field of domestic violence in Kenosha, Kenosha did not have any domestic violence ordinance or arrest law of any sort. It was usually prosecuted under a disorderly conduct type of charge and fined out at about $40. So a beating was worth $40. Fairly trivial. What I think to be kind of a landmark, though I could be wrong, and I'm not a historian, and I'm looking at this just from my own unique perspective on the shores of Lake Michigan. I think a landmark document was the Attorney General's Task Force on Family Violence that came out in 1984. Because of that document, the document stated that in order to make progress in addressing family violence, that it had to be addressed at all levels of the criminal justice system. That family violence had to be responded to as a crime. And I think that had some very important implications. First, I think it was a national scope sort of document coming down to all of us and saying, hey, America, we have to do something. I think it also was a message of, as society's representative, the criminal justice system was being called upon to hold the batterer accountable, and accountable for a number of things. For the violence that he perpetrated, first of all, for stopping his violence, and also for the legal consequences of his violence, whatever those may be, ranging from fines to jail to probation to mandated rehabilitation counseling. And this then, I think, led to notions of development of criminal justice policies and procedures to begin to formally address batterer accountability in areas of mandatory arrest, pro-prosecution, and mandatory counseling. But the next question arises from development of all of these, on paper, fairly interesting and positive strategies, is how well do these interventions work? And I think that's where I want to start off now by turning on the slide presentation here and reviewing some of the state of the knowledge. I'm going to break this down into three, so just turn the light on, Gary. I think you push it straight forward, all the way. Okay. Break this down into three areas of discussion. I want to do a very brief overview of the studies on the effects of mandatory arrest. Then I want to talk about pro-prosecution research, a little that's been done, and then briefly do an overview of issues related to mandatory batterer rehabilitation counseling. And as I say, as I go through these things, I hope to point out areas of future direction as well before I get into a final spiel on that whole issue. So let me start out here first with just briefly giving an overview of the effects of mandatory arrest. Now, I've divided the few studies that I'm aware of into three basic conceptual categories. Because I was coming out to Montana, I decided to use a Wild West metaphor in which to sort of categorize these studies. And the metaphor has not so much to do with the quality of the research of these studies, because I didn't want to bother myself with that at this point, but rather I wanted to focus on the emotional reaction of the service provider and the policymaker that one might have in reaction to these studies. So those of you who are Clint Eastwood fans will understand the metaphor right away. We'll start off with the good. This is represented by the landmark Sherman and Birch study in Minneapolis in 1984. Basically, this study found that and reported that arrest resulted in lower levels of recidivism 6 months after the arrest than other more traditional at that time police interventions such as informal mediation or a brief 8-hour separation. As I say, I'm not going to evaluate this study on its scientific merits, but I just want to say that this study, in some of the readings I've done since that time, is viewed as a landmark study in that it was very influential in convincing many police departments across the country, and many communities, even many states, in adopting mandatory arrest policies as a way of confronting domestic violence and dealing with perpetrators. Indeed, probably within the last 5 months, in our own county task force meeting, in which we were, again, as we do every month, struggling with what are we going to do and how are we going to continue to progress, the police officer who represents the police department on the task force said, well, I don't see why we even bother talking about this. We already know what the most effective intervention is. It's arrest. We've got to arrest them. The Minneapolis study showed that. So it's a very influential study. But let's take a look a little further down. Many call for replication of that study, and indeed some 5 replications have been done. I don't know if they're all completed at this point yet. I've got information on a couple, 2 or 3 more, and the next 2 fit into what I would call the bad. Now again, this is not a message about the quality of the research, but rather how do we feel when we see the results of these studies. We have this time of initial almost euphoria of we got to arrest them, it's going to work, the Minneapolis study showed it, but when we look at a couple other studies that have been done, one by Frank Dunford and Associates, this was in Omaha, the other one by David Herschel and his associates in Charlotte, North Carolina, they found that arrest was no more nor no less effective than other more traditional police response mechanisms, including mediation, separation, or the issues of a citation. So now we have to start to rethink just a little bit.
Does arrest include jail time?
I'm not sure. Might have been an overnight jail. No? Okay. All right. As I said, I didn't try to, pick this apart real carefully. But the point here is, maybe mandatory arrest, isn't all that effective, but on the hopeful side, if you talk to Frank Dunford anyway, he says, but at least it's not any worse than the other methods. Either women weren't getting beaten more. And that's been a legitimate concern of battered women's advocates is, gee, what happens after the guy's arrested? He's going to get more angry to go home and beat his partner even more for making him go through this. Boy, whoa. Okay, then we get to the ugly. This is really discouraging for anybody who pinned their hopes on mandatory arrest as panacea for solving the problem of domestic violence. I didn't see the publication, the scientific report on this. This was reported in the Milwaukee Journal because this represents one of the replication attempts that took place in Milwaukee. And it was also done by Lawrence Sherman, who did the original Minneapolis study. And Sherman was quoted in the journal as saying, we're seeing arrest backfire in about half the cases. And the increased recidivism was most observed among people who were unemployed and who were unmarried. This also led Sherman to speak out about the need to rethink mandatory arrests and probably even repeal those laws in states that have them. That led to an uproar as well in Wisconsin. So I think what the future is going to hold is a lot of discussion and a lot of debate about the relative merits of mandatory arrest and where we should go with that. A local, well-known battered women's advocate in Milwaukee opposes, for example, repealing the mandatory arrest law because it has a lot to do with issues of accountability. Once again, if we take the law away, then what does that say? What message is that delivering to men who batter? And yet, other people have resulted in a spate of letters to the editor in the journal suggesting that it's a feel-good policy and all it does is get battered women hurt more. So I believe there's going to be a lot more discussion about this as time goes on. I don't have a particular opinion about it. I think mandating has a place, but I think we need to, I guess what this probably tells me is mandatory arrest, once again, by itself, in a vacuum, probably shouldn't be expected to be a very powerful deterrent for recidivism. For a case in point, it's my understanding that in Milwaukee, they have a prosecution rate of about 10%. So 90 out of every 100 men who are arrested, never sees a judge, never faces any charges or any other sanctions other than maybe some time in jail overnight or some such thing as that, or at least the inconvenience of dealing with the police. So here's where we got to look at how do we connect things together. Maybe the community should be challenged in this kind of a scenario to develop advocacy systems and safety mechanisms for battered women and children as well, over and above what is already in place. Yeah, I think maybe we can be lulled into complacency thinking that the police are going to take care of it and it's going to make it all go away. But we see with at least a certain identifiable part of this population that that's just not the case. Well, I tried to look at some literature in the area of prosecution research with domestic violence. And I haven't found very much. There may be some anecdotal kinds of papers out there that I didn't see. But I did run into one study. It was conducted by a man named David Ford and his associate in Indianapolis. It's called I think that's the title, it's the Indianapolis Prosecution Experiment. Now this is kind of an interesting experiment. I just wanted to spend a few moments sort of laying this out for you just to show you what they did. I thought it was pretty clever. Basically, they had two kinds of arrest conditions. One was a victim-initiated arrest, where the woman could go down and press charges, file charges, pretty much on her own. And the other was an on-scene arrest, where the police made an arrest. At the time of this study, Indianapolis was instituting a mandatory or pro-arrest policy, and so they included that as part of the experiment as well. Once an arrest was made, there were 4 conditions that the batterer could be randomized into. One could be a no prosecution condition. Now, I need to explain this just a little bit, because they didn't just arrest him and then decide not to prosecute, but basically this was based on a drop permitted policy. So the battered woman was given permission if she initiated the arrest. This only counted for the victim-initiated arrest. She was given permission to drop the charges. She was given assurances that she would be supported by the system even if she did drop the charges. That is, they weren't going to hold this against her. But they also gave her assurances that they would be with her and support her through the entire prosecution process should she decide not to drop the charges. And so they were making a commitment to the battered woman. She wasn't just left out in the cold with the prosecution taking over without her. Now, the other conditions were a pretrial diversion to a rehabilitation program, prosecution to conviction with probation, supervised rehabilitation, and conviction with other conditions, including jail time. Now, what were the results of this study? Basically, Ford and Rigoli found that with victim-initiated arrests, they had the lowest recidivist rate. 7 in the case. If the woman dropped the charges, then it was slightly higher. Rather than whether the man was violent, fire settlement, whether they cohabited, and so forth. But basically speaking, that's the bottom line of the findings. If the police initiated the arrest, then regardless of the other 3 treatment conditions that the man was randomized into, this had the highest rates of recidivism of about 80%. Now, of particular interest, the final finding, because this relates in particular, at least superficially, to those of us who do batterer counseling, was they found that if prosecution led to probation and supervised mandatory counseling, that they actually saw increases in rates of violence rather than decreases. That made me a little nervous when I saw that, so I called Dr. Ford and asked him about it, and he basically said that at this point they don't know what that means, because they did not study, for example, whether or not men in this condition were more likely to drop out of treatment versus stay in treatment, nor did they do any quality assurance studies of the particular treatment conditions. But at least it certainly should give us pause to reflect on what we're doing when we're working with the criminal justice system in mandating treatment. Now, this is kind of an interesting study, and Ford interprets this as suggesting that when the battered woman is empowered by the system to make decisions and have control over that process, that whole system works much more effectively than if that power and decision-making process is taken out of her hands. And I think there's cause for hopefulness here, but I also want to encourage us to be somewhat pessimistic about this whole thing, at least scientifically, given the lessons we learned from the Sherman and Burke study in 1984. At the very least, I think that as hopeful as this study is, the hopefulness should be geared toward, at this point, some replications of this study before we recommend some wholesale utilization of these particular methods that worked in Indiana. We don't know if they're going to work somewhere else yet. Okay, what about mandatory treatment? I have to admit, I was part of a group of people in Kenosha in Wisconsin who yelled long and hard, we got to get these men into treatment, we got to make them go to treatment. We just saw some stuff from the Ford and Rigoli study that says, well, gee, if we mandate them into treatment and force them and supervise them on probation and parole, it might not be all that effective. A few questions come to mind about this. One, does the criminal justice mandating result in more men going to treatment and remaining in treatment? I want to start there. I'll work my way through to whether or not it's more effective in affecting recidivism and so on as we go along. One way we can answer this question is yes, but let me back up just a little bit and talk about why it's important to think about mandating and how we got to that point in the first place. Very recently, I think it was a 1991 issue of Journal of Family Violence, Ed Gondolf and some associates published a paper in which they studied attrition from domestic violence counseling over a 1-year time period. And this was kind of a neat study, I thought, because what they did was they cataloged and kept data on the number of men within a year's time, who actually called the program and inquired about the domestic violence counseling program and began to talk about the need for getting into counseling for themselves. They followed all those men across a year's time to the point where they should have finished the treatment program. And what they found was that, let's say, hypothetically, they had 100 men at the beginning. Of those 100 men, 1 year later, only 7 completed the treatment program. 93% of the men who actually called a clinic or a program to get involved in treatment did not finish that treatment program. Now the numbers, in terms of whether they were court-ordered or not court-ordered, were basically, in my estimation, too small to make too much of it. So, I don't have a lot to say about that, other than to say that the implications of that kind of study are that, again, many men may look into treatment, but they don't go to treatment. We all know that. We all know that already. 1986, Jim Hastings and I published a paper in Journal of Interpersonal Violence in which we offered absolutely free of charge, no cost at all to the domestically violent men that we were able to identify through a one-day workshop, a 12-week treatment program. So we at least tried to eliminate one barrier to access to treatment, and it's cost factors. And we found of the total pool that we solicited, 1/3 agreed that they would like to go to treatment. So 33% of those men said, yeah, okay, I think I need more treatment and I'll come. But of that group, only half came to treatment. And I'm not sure, we didn't look at how many dropped out even. So again, about 14 or 15% of the total pool actually went into treatment, even when it was offered free. So these men do not, and this was prior to a court mandating system in our community. So again, these men are not seekers of domestic violence treatment. That doesn't mean they're not into the mental health system or the alcohol and drug abuse system. Many of these men have been in multiple treatments over the years in their lives, but they're not looking at themselves as in need of battery treatment. Hastings, I also did another study in which we looked at, we tried to determine whether we could predict with any degree of certainty whether what kinds of men would drop out of treatment prematurely once they got there compared to those who would complete the treatment. And let me just say, in terms of court mandating, we did find the court mandating variable to be a significant predictor. About 2/3 of the men who were court-ordered completed treatment, compared to 42% of the men who were not mandated completed treatment, and that was a significant effect. But I want to expand on discussion of this study just a little bit because it does also get at what Susan was talking about earlier, some system accountability and how we can use even our in-program research to evaluate what we're doing and what we may need to do a little bit differently. So we found, for example, volunteer status. I used that finding also as further lobbying effort to maintain and expand some of the mandating policies in the city of Kenosha. We found that African American men were more likely to drop out of treatment than Caucasian men. Men who were unemployed were more likely to drop out. Men who had an elevation on the alcohol abuse subscale of the Milan Clinical Multi-Axis Inventory, which is a personality inventory that we use, were more likely to drop out prematurely. And men who had a longer list of what we call pre-treatment miscellaneous acting out offenses. Things like, these were, as far as we could tell, not violent offenses, but things like disorderly conduct unrelated to domestic abuse, hit and run accidents, reckless driving, absconding from probation, the sorts of things that would suggest that this is a person who has some difficulty with authority, perhaps. But it's not necessarily, but these do not necessarily fall into a violent offender category, those particular offenses. Anyway, we found those things. With those sorts of characteristics, we found we could correctly predict about 3/4 of completers and dropouts. Now, I wanted to just go back to this and make a couple more statements about feeding the research back into your program. I started asking African American men about their experience in the program, for example, how come they were dropping out, what that was all about. Some of it had to do with access. Many of these men live in the inner city of Kenosha. It's not a very big city, but there's an inner city core, and we are way out on the edge. So that meant changing some policies about talking to people about bus routes before they come out, hooking up a buddy system within the group to get rides for those who didn't drive. But also, and I think more importantly from our perspective, it was not unusual to find one African American man in a group of 10, with the other 9 being white, and feeling very isolated, very alienated. And so as a result, we made some changes there to balance the ratio of racial and ethnic composition of the groups. I haven't had a chance to look at how that maneuver has worked at this point, but we've got that data in the file and I want to take a look at it. As far as the alcohol abuse thing goes, when I first started this program, I was reluctant to require men to get into treatment for alcoholism, either before or during the time they were in battery treatment. It's pretty good con artist, and you do this song and dance about, I can't afford it, I can't do all this stuff, you're killing me with all these therapy assignments. But when I saw this, and we take a look at the recidivism research we did, when I saw all this, I just said, no, you have to do it all. You do it all or you do nothing, it's all part of your battery rehab. Okay. Another way of asking about whether court mandating is more likely to get men in treatment is a little more qualified response than a pure yes. Maybe it depends. This is best exemplified by a study by Dan Saunders and his colleague Jennifer Parker. They broke it down by type of person. So they did a person by system interactional type of study. And basically what they found was that court mandating did seem to be more effective with younger, less well-educated individuals. Non-mandated completers were more likely to be older, perhaps a tad more mature, although I suppose that's debatable, but maybe more conventional anyway, college-educated, less severe in their violence. Now, I don't know exactly what to make of that particular study or that study in comparison to the research that Hastings and I did on completers and dropouts. But I think in terms of the future, what this tells us is that we can begin to look, and we probably should begin to look at, what are those risk factors for leaving treatment early? I mean, clearly, that may even end up being a moot point if we can't demonstrate that treatment is at all effective. But assuming that there's some effectiveness of the treatment, how come men are dropping out of treatment before their scheduled time?
I just want to know, we're saying court mandated, and I basically know what it means, but looking at this, does this mean if they don't go, they go to jail?
Well, that's a good point, and actually that's my next part of the discussion. I'm really glad that you brought that up, putting right into my hands. Okay. I also think, and I just want to finish this little piece up here and say that I think that this information is also important for those of us who are providing services to battered women or to batterers, because presumably if we're working with batterers, we ought to maybe have some contact with battered women as well to talk to them about the risks of treatment and the non-guaranteed outcome of treatment. I provide this kind of information to battered women who come to see me, that their partner fits a profile that puts him at risk of repeating violence more so than others. Not that I make guarantees that anybody's not going to repeat violence, but I can see somebody fits into an even higher risk category. I feel an obligation to tell that to the woman. Similarly with dropping out of treatment, because that can give her information about what she may want to do about the relationship, about her status with that relationship, or at least safety planning kinds of concerns. Okay, another aspect of system accountability that I want to talk about has to do with different kinds of mandates. We talk in a pretty facile way in this whole field of court mandated batterer, and it's like as though all of these sorts of things are all exactly the same from one community to the next, and I don't think they are, even within a particular community. So, for example, in Kenosha, there are actually 3 different ways by which a man can be court mandated, quote unquote, into treatment. And one of the things that I got interested in is, rather than look at batterer characteristics related to treatment completion or dropout, I wanted to look at mandate referral source characteristics related to completion, treatment, or dropout as well. And so in Kenosha, for example, we have, as I say, the 3 types. One is a probation and parole referral. Now, this can be part of a criminal court proceeding where the man is found guilty of battery and then he's put on 2 years probation in order to go to counseling as part of that, and that's supervised by the probation officer. It can also happen where a man who's not on probation or parole for a battery is found out by his probation officer that he's battering, and then they can order him to treatment as well. There's also a deferred prosecution type of referral. And in Kenosha, the way it works is the man must enter a plea of guilty right up front. And so it's actually, I think, would probably more properly be called a deferred judgment thing, because he admits his guilt to the offense, but he's given the opportunity to complete treatment, and if he does that, then successfully, whatever that means, his charge is either reduced or dropped, and that depends on the deal that his lawyer is able to cut him. But the point being, he has to enter a plea. If he does not successfully complete treatment, then they go ahead and complete the prosecution and the judgment against him. That's usually at a misdemeanor or felony level, more typically at a misdemeanor level. Our particular district attorney has a stated policy that felony level people belong in prison, and that's what he sees as the primary treatment for them first. So we deal mainly with misdemeanor level folks in our program. The third referral source in Kenosha is municipal court. This is like traffic court. It's a very weak, low-level court. This actually turned out, historically, was the first court system, interestingly enough, in our community to be interested in doing something about domestic violence. And it was only several years later where the criminal court folks caught on and decided this is something they should do too. I think the mandatory arrest law probably has something to do with that. But basically, these are offenses that are viewed as not rising to the level of a misdemeanor, not winnable in a criminal level trial, but they know the man has done something, they can issue a citation. In Kenosha, they fine him $625 for that offense, and then he can work that fine down to $85 by completing treatment. So, presumably, some of these referral sources may have differential levels of strength. Now, Hastings and I were interested in looking at whether there were differential rates of dropping out of treatment as a function of court system, and also whether there were differential rates of delivery of the negative consequence to the man for failing to complete his treatment. These numbers are very small, and I'm sorry you can't see it. It's kind of from a typed copy, but basically, let me just start out by saying that there were no statistically significant differences in the rate of dropout between these three court conditions. There were also no statistically significant, about a third of the men dropped out. There were also no statistically significant differences in the rate of delivery of negative consequences for dropping out, but municipal court was clearly the weakest court system here, of only 47%, over 50% of the men did not get a sanction for their dropout. Now, this is partly related, I believe, to the weakness of that court system itself. This court system is not empowered, for example, to issue an active bench warrant to go out and get this guy and drag him in for not complying. As a probation agent, for example, I could pick up the phone and call a probation agent in my community and say, so-and-so's not complying, and I suspended him. And as often as not, the probation agent says, well, he'll be in jail today, or he'll be there next week, or some such thing as that. And they go out and get him, and they bring him in, and they do something about it. So, again, differential strength, what the systems are empowered to do, can make a difference, I believe, in how effective that system works. With respect to no-shows, these are men who just plain never had a first appointment. Never kept that first appointment, or never even called for a first appointment, but were known to be supposed to. We kept track of this over about a 1-year time period. And we found that almost 50% of municipal court referrals didn't even show up for their first visit. And that compares to about close to 20 to 25% for the other two stronger systems. So it tells you that, again, these men probably need to have a hammer over them, a pretty heavy hammer, to get them to treatment. And if they can figure out the cracks to slip through, they will. What about rate of consequence delivery? Again, almost 2/3 of the municipal court no-shows were not sanctioned for their failure to show up. They were able to slip through the cracks and avoid any kind of consequence whatsoever, compared to about 25%, 15% for the deferred prosecution and the probation parole conditions, respectively. Again, I think this tells us that, operating in isolation, some of these systems may be limited. Somehow we have to have ongoing communication, we have to work together. And we also have to, as communities, make some reasonable decisions about what kind of a system we're going to work with and how we're going to put that in place. It says also that we need to look at things like consequence delivery, and whether or not these these programs that we have on paper are working the way they're supposed to work. Now, let me just summarize this whole section. How much time do I have? Ron's going to give you an hour. I might have 15 minutes. Okay. The implications of this part is, from my perspective, first of all, I'm not down on mandating, but I think I want to be reasonably realistic about it. I think we should mandate people. I think we should arrest batterers because it tells them that they are accountable, that they've done wrong, and that society's not going to put up with their violence. Mandating does get more men in treatment than we've ever seen before. I was talking to somebody earlier this morning in which I said in years past, the summertime would be a low point for me as far as group treatment goes. I would end up having, throughout most of the summer, I had groups of anywhere from 3 to 7 guys because we wouldn't be seeing very many of these guys. But since we've had mandatory arrests in our community the last 3 years, the only thing that goes down now is the waiting list. The groups are full, so more men are getting into treatment. Again, some of this is based on the assumption that treatment works, and that's an issue I want to talk about in the future, subsequently too. More men, I think, are staying in treatment when they're ordered, particularly if it's through some of the stronger systems. But the caveat here, from my perspective, is that we ought not to look at these mandates as some kind of magical panacea that's going to solve all of our problems of getting these men to go along with our plan. Because clearly, many of them don't. Many men will repeat violence right after an arrest. Many of them will not follow through on treatment. They won't even show up for their first appointment. And even if they finish treatment, they'll repeat violence subsequently. But given these flaws, I'm supportive because it brings the community into the process. It takes it away from this batterer program. Is it going to work or not? And it takes it away from one dimension of the community. And it really requires that the whole community, once again, form that network that Susan was talking about. Not only to provide a safety net for battered women, but as I look at it, to also provide what I call a spider web for domestically violent men, to, at every turn, hold them accountable for what they're doing. To tell them at every turn, you're wrong, you must stop it, and we'll provide you with some resources to change your behavior. Okay, let's skip ahead now and talk about a little bit about treatment outcome. How well does treatment work? That's a typical question at both conferences like this and also in speaking with battered women, domestically violent men, all kinds of folks. They always say, well, how well does this treatment work? I'm not so sure that we have the answer to that. I think that the best answer is we have a lot of reasonably promising leads. We have some ideas, but we have few solid answers. Partly because I think that question is framed in a way that oversimplifies the whole issue. How well does treatment work? I think maybe a better question, a more appropriate question, and something that I hope to have time to get into in terms of future directions, is how well does what kind of treatment work with what kind of perpetrator? Gary.
Sorry, I have to ask this question. Claudia Black, in her book, Battered Women Who Kill, identified that the greatest predictor of whether or not a man would be a batterer is that he observed violence in his own family setting. And that's not to minimize the effects of actual physical violence. And I was wondering, in terms of your research, did you come across, how many men did you come across who came from families where there was physical violence?
Actually, across research studies, that number varies widely. I think I've seen some numbers in some studies that have suggested 80% of the domestically violent men that they studied came from such a background. We find about 40%, and I think we're on the low end of the spectrum. I think some of that can have to do with how you ask about that kind of sort of thing as well. I think it's probably well accepted that that's a risk marker for violence. By most of us who work in the field, though not necessarily viewed as a proximal cause. Just a brief rundown. These are some of the reasons why it's hard to answer the question about the effectiveness of treatment. Many studies, I just got done reviewing about 16 or 20 of the current published studies, the collection of outcome studies out there, and these are the kinds of problems that most of these studies, including stuff I've done, are plagued with. Small sample sizes, samples of 10 to 15. maybe 20. Non-random treatment assignment, in other words, for using convenience sorts of samples like treatment completers versus treatment dropouts, look at recidivism. That's not a random sort of thing, so it doesn't really tell us whether the treatment is working. It might tell us more about the motivation of certain men to complete treatment. Inadequate variable specification. In other words, what did they do? And sometimes, we're not even sure what people who wrote the studies did in terms of an intervention. Traditionally, we've talked about follow-up intervals. 6-month follow-up intervals might be, for example, very inadequate for this kind of low base rate behavior. We may have to draw this out a couple of years for doing follow-up, but that leads to other attrition problems as well. Outcome measures. What are we talking about when we ask about how well treatment works? Are we talking about stopping physical violence? Are we talking about reducing the rates of physical violence, the severity of physical violence? Are we talking about increased levels of feelings of safety and comfort in the battered woman? These are the different kinds of things that people have done, have looked at, but it's not something that's done universally across every study. So it makes it hard to interpret how well treatment works generally. And then what I call anomalous findings, things that just don't add up. For example, a recent study that came out of Minneapolis, the DAP program, where they looked at structured and educational programs and more unstructured treatment. And then they found at a 12-month follow-up period that the structured program completers were less likely to be violent than unstructured program completers. But at 18 months, that trend reversed. What does that mean? We don't know. So, there are a lot of questions. And I think this still continues to be a very wide open field of research and discussion in our field. So I see that in the next 10 years. Those are the kinds of issues that have to be addressed before we can actually talk confidently about how well treatment works. Just a very brief, since I'm a speaker here and I kind of plug my own stuff a little bit, a very flawed study that we did as well on treatment outcome. Just the bottom line here is, again, we looked at treatment completers versus dropouts. Again, a flawed study, not randomly assigned. But we did find that men who completed treatment were more likely to not repeat violence across a 1-year time period compared to men who dropped out of the treatment. What we did not find interesting were changes in their personality disorder characteristics. I don't have any time to talk about that, but we hypothesized in that particular study that maybe that has something to do with the failure of a lot of treatment programs to deal with or address some of these chronic, deeply ingrained and entrenched personality patterns. If we don't deal with those, maybe we can't expect, for example, the psychological battering mechanisms or maneuvers that these men use to stop, because by definition, these people do that kind of stuff. Perhaps a more interesting question is the repeat of violence following treatment? And can we begin to identify at any rare form who's more likely to repeat violence? Again, these are not universal answers or absolute answers to questions like this, but they can begin to give us leads and tell us what other sorts of things we need to start taking a look at over time to try to improve not only our treatment programs, but improve the kind of information we give to battered women. And so we looked at, in treatment completers, the difference between those who repeated violence versus those who didn't. Basically, let me just summarize without burdening you with all the numbers. Men who reported pre-treatment alcohol abuse problems, as well as post-treatment alcohol abuse problems, were at a high risk of repeated violence. Men who were, there was no effect of court ordering, by the way. There was no effect, no difference between court-ordered and non-court-ordered men in their repeated violence after they completed treatment. And again, I think that has to take us back to looking at and qualifying our acceptance of mandate. It's no guarantee. You need to understand it. It's important information to provide their partners. We did find that men who showed a narcissistic kind of personality profile, somebody who tends to view his partner only in terms of her functionality to him, does not look at her as a separate person who's autonomous, who has her own perspective, who has her own feelings and reactions to situations, but really imposes his own perspective and sense of entitlement onto her. These men were very likely to repeat violence. That was a big part of that. And when we threw it all together, into an analysis to see how these things worked out to predict recidivism. We found we could identify about 2/3, once again, of men who repeated violence over a 1-year time period. But that also means that we couldn't predict the other third. And I guess that's the caution in all of this is, we cannot be talking to our battered women clients about, well, he doesn't have these characteristics, so you don't have to worry. I think we always have to qualify what treatment means, that we don't know how well it's going to work out. We cannot predict how well it's going to work with any given individual. But if he has these risk markers, I think we also have an obligation to point that out as well, to be realistic. Most typically, for example, narcissism is described by the battered woman as, he thinks his shit's good to eat, that kind of stuff. The world won't stop taping. Delete that from the tape. Those kind of things. He thinks the world revolves around him and that kind of stuff. And so when I hear that kind of stuff, that caused me to go back and look at some of the personality data, but it also causes me to say to her, he's at a high level, high risk in my experience in repeating violence. We have to be careful. We need to do some real safety plan. Let me talk a little more, 5 more minutes left, about the, well, we're off schedule anyway, aren't we, a little bit? So. Let's talk a little bit about future directions in treatment. There's a lot of controversy about what kinds of treatment are more effective or more appropriate versus those that shouldn't be used. And I heard a little bit of that talk about already today about whether people should get involved in conjoint treatment or not. But even within gender-specific treatment, there's discussion about what sort of focus is most appropriate and which is not. Basically, I think perhaps one of the more important questions to be asking about, in addition to does treatment work at all, better than no treatment, is what type of treatment works best with what kind of persons. And I would like to see in the next 10 years work that targets different kinds of individuals. We know, for example, whether it's 40%, 80%, there are men who come into our treatment programs with very serious abuse histories. I've had men literally experience flashbacks of their own abuse experience right in front of me as I'm asking them about their abuse experience. And I'm wondering if some of these men need a different kind of treatment approach than some of the more standard sorts of cognitive behavioral things that we seem to think works well with this population. Maybe Dan Saunders, by the way, is doing a study of that sort. I think he calls it his Wounded Man study, in which he's looking at whether a more, quote, psychodynamic supportive approach that looks at these trauma experiences has a different kind of effect with men who have histories of severe abuse compared to those who don't. Ed Gondoff has suggested the need for residential treatment for some kinds of batterers. I haven't seen any writing about residential treatment for batterers at this point, but there may be some men who are so antisocial, so resistant to authority, so unable to function without repeating violence and without intimidation and terror outside that they may need to be involved in an inpatient residential program, perhaps even while they're in prison. I know many prisons do have various kinds of rehab programs, although in Wisconsin a lot of that focuses on things like alcohol and drug abuse and criminal thinking and only touches on battering as part of that. I'm wondering if maybe there should be creative efforts made at developing batterer programs. We certainly need to look at AODA issues much more closely. I'm surprised that there isn't more batterer treatment in conjunction with alcohol and drug abuse residential treatment programs. We've tried very hard in our community to get that to be part of a couple of the inpatient programs and meets with all kinds of resistance for reasons sometimes not well articulated. But I certainly think that those things can be done together and probably should be. I think we need to also be culturally sensitive in the sense that batterer treatment programs, I think, would best arise out of the community within which they're going to occur rather than be imposed from the outside. That's why I'm not here talking about what works in Kenosha, Wisconsin, because I'm not so sure that what seems to work there is going to work in Missoula, Montana, or in Wyoming. Another area that I think we need to look at in treatment is exactly what are domestically violent men learning in those programs. We do read about, very minute descriptions and minute detail of what is done in treatment programs. in terms of manuals and publications, we haven't got a clue about what these men are actually learning. No research has been done in this area. What the typical research protocol is, you do a treatment, you describe it, and you look at an outcome. So you have some kind of a correlation study. But what happens in between? What the processes of change are? You know, especially successful men who make it work for them. We don't really know what that is. I think we need to look at that. Now, finally, then I'll wrap up. Now, I think I've been very depressed, I have to admit, it's a personal note. I've been depressed the past year related to what I'm doing. And I think I lost perspective as a therapist in this field. Even though I've been actively involved in our local county task force for about 7 years, it's easy to begin to feel like you're the only one doing this kind of work. You begin to feel very lonely if you network with people. And that's why I became depressed. I began to think, hey, this ain't working. I'm being swamped. I'm not getting a break. But I have to realize, and I think we all need to realize, at least I'm going to invite you to realize, that what we are doing, particularly with, and I'm focusing on and directing my comments to domestically violent men, but I think the same applies to battered women, is we're really putting a Band-Aid over a gushing artery. We're trying to bring the bullet back into the chamber after the trigger's been pulled. And that's very, very hard to do. And I think ultimately, the only long-term strategy is to begin to do primary prevention work. And this is where I was resonating very closely with what I was hearing Susan say. I think the legislative efforts have all been very important. The gains made from that are important, but alone they can't do much. Shelters aren't going to make battering men stop their battering. Battering programs by themselves probably aren't going to do it either. Arrest laws don't do it, we see that. Prosecution policies don't do it in every instance either. I think partly we need to develop a network of safety for battered women again and accountability for batterers, but we also need to begin with raising up a new generation of people, of boys, who begin to see girls, ultimately men who see women, as equal autonomous human beings who may respect, for whom violence is inappropriate in any circumstance. Now, ideas and areas that I'd like to see this, certainly in the mass media once again. Now, I was coming at this from a slightly different perspective again, and I'm thinking about community education by the mass media. I think we can learn lessons from efforts to educate about AIDS, efforts to educate about smoking, efforts to educate about seatbelt use, and efforts to educate about drugs, like through partnership with Drug Free America. And I think we can begin to learn from the lessons positive and negative from these different efforts to see what we need to do about educating the community in a massive way about battering, about the wrongfulness of battering one's partner. I'd like to see continuation of that momentum of the Surgeon General's initiative, the AMA's initiative. On a very small sense, I'm very pleased to say, for example, in Kenosha and at the Medical College, that we will be starting, for the first time in the history of the Medical College of Wisconsin, a multidisciplinary across the lifespan family violence curriculum for the medical students. But it took about 6 years to get. In the city of Kenosha, we've also developed a battered women's advocacy program in our local hospital. And I see Susan shaking her head. You probably saw Kevin Fullen, the cardiologist who started it. And it came from a physician, and that's what's very important. Again, that's the idea of coming from within the community. We need to look at school-based curricula for violence-free relationships, both at the elementary level and in the junior high and high school level. But I think we need to start at the elementary level, because these are the people who can be reached, who haven't been sullied yet. And finally, and I know that I see Ron sitting here in his chair, he really wants to get going. Finally, I think we need to begin spreading these messages in our churches and synagogues and temples as well. It's so easy to pick on homosexuals from the pulpit and other disenfranchised groups and to say that's a sin. But I don't think I've ever heard a sermon in my church about the sinfulness of battery. I don't think you've ever had that. Maybe a few isolated places. We need to provide messages to the youth in the congregation that it's absolutely wrong. We need to provide support for battered women in the congregation. We also need to provide confrontive support to battering men. tell them like it is, but to provide them support for getting change, for making changes too. And I think it's only when multiple community components come together and work together to send these messages to stop violence. That's the only time I think we're going to see real change in stopping this epidemic. Thank you.
I'd like to introduce Ron Terrio to do the commentary on this. Ron's the director of the Native American Studies Department at Salish Kootenai College here in Pablo. He's the visiting professor at the University of Montana here in Missoula, where he teaches classes in Native American history. He served 4 years as tribal councilman and 1 year as the chairman of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. Ron has lectured at state universities in New York, Albany, and Cobleskill, at Harvard, and at Yale. He's on the Native American Studies, all of these have been in Native American Studies with emphasis on contemporary issues. He's done workshops for us here at the YWCA, on the Montana Committee for the Humanities, the U.S. Forest Service, the Missoula Museum for the Arts, many public schools, community events, institutions, and that kind of cross-cultural issues. He has a BA in comparative psychology. He's also served 25 years in the U.S. Infantry, retiring with the rank of Command Sergeant Major. He's a veteran of Korea, Vietnam, and assorted revolutions. With that, I introduce Ron Terrio.
Thank you very much. Commentary won't be that long, but I think there's something that I've been seeing, and I've heard both the speakers, and there's something that when someone asks the question, what can we do about this, there is definitely something we can do about this. It's not easy, but there's something we can do about it. But first, I'd like to, as a historian, 116 years ago today, at about this time, Custer's command experienced what we call permanent biological advancement cessation. And I looked at the makeup of this audience when I first came in the room, and I said, if the first guy that gets up to talk is named George, I'm leaving. Simply because of the experience that what this evolves about, the violence. Now, one of the reasons on the introduction that I wanted to leave in what was said, it is a clear indication that a large portion of my life is violent, has been violent. I have been trained to be violent. I have been conditioned to be violent. I have carried out the expectations of violence. Yet in my life, I have never struck a woman. That is unacceptable. And I thought it's interesting that this very day that we came to this conference, my wife and I had a situation with another set of people, and they wanted to bring a child to our house for security, and I had to say, if there is a possibility that the husband comes to my door and threatens my family, I will do him in. Think about that before you carry out what you want to do. And I realized I was carrying on the very tradition that's been created in me, which is, I'm not going to talk to him, I'm going to do him in, because no one threatens my territory. So I'm probably a product and a great example that someone could look at and say, Kevin's studies are wonderful. And I say they're wonderful for this because he doesn't give you a model. He doesn't give you, there's a batterer. You can look at it and see it. But what he does is give you all the indications. I listened very closely to everything he had to say, and I did better than that. I read all the articles that he sent me. I become a nut because I kept saying, okay, Kevin, the next page is going to give me the answer. And that's what we're looking for. We always say, here it is. These do this, 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 and this. Here's the answer. It's coming. I never got an answer. And so when Kevin, I saw him this morning, the first thing I asked, what's the answer? And very nicely he told me, I don't know. Because he can't really give us the answer. I don't think anyone can right now. But I would recommend strongly, from what I've read of the documentation that Kevin has put together, that everybody involved in this particular issue get that information. And it goes back to a military lifetime. Know your enemy. Know every possible thing you can about them, especially when he talks about these particular people have the potential of repeating, because there are certain things there. He doesn't say they will, but the potential is there. You should know that. You should be doing more than what I see happening on the victim. Everyone recognizes the victim. The victim goes into acceptance. I'm being abused. People accept she's being abused. Then people say treatment. And then after the fact, prevention. But then look at the batterer. It comes in the same sequence of recognition, acceptance, treatment, and after the fact, prevention. And what you're doing is you're stalled in a whirlpool. You're not changing the batter. You're not changing what is creating the batter. And yet you need the information. There's no bottle batter. You can't find them out there. And you can't go by that anyway. People who look like angels, be careful. Because we're all masters of disguises. That's why we have clothes. If we could all take our clothes off and walk around, number one, we'd all be disgusting. Number two, we would really not talk to each other then. We would holler across the room, but not much in conversation. The thought that came to my mind was that what we heard first from Susan, and I heard in there a frustration and an anger and everything there, but I heard completely frustration. And I can understand that existence, because all of you, as either trying to be people in the treatment system, trying to find an answer, and it's becoming apparent there's no one answer, okay? There's nothing that we can grasp. So I came down to commentary which comes to my mind. Who's working to change the progressive cause of the social order? In other words, changing the batterer now is like a murder. That's after the fact. When do we start working with a society that a boy does not have to be tough, that a boy does not have to own a gun, that a boy does not have to play cowboys and Indians, that he does not have to defend his honor by punching out somebody else? When do we change the attitude of the child, especially the male child, being one of them? Even now, I'm still a male child. And every now and then I lose it, and it proves it to everybody I ever deal with. But it's not what we're doing right now. There's nothing wrong with that. We're doing what we can with what we have to work with. But we have to give up something and start back and start changing the concept that we have in this society. That's where violence is created. My son has a cute little habit of walking by and popping my daughter on the rump. It's been made very clear to him that that is not acceptable conduct. It may be, well, I just do it because I like her. I says, if you like her, go by and rub her shoulder and say, I love you. Don't pop her on the butt. That is how I'm going to change it. Now, I don't whip my children either, by the way. My first children, I can't say that. But new family, I never lay a hand on them. Violence makes me physically ill. And you have to think about that when you think about what my background is. I can't handle that. But I realize that if we're going to change with the problem you're working on right now, it has to start just like it does with everything else in this society, back at a beginning generation. Changing the attitude, blowing up TV sets. I'm serious. You look at the conditioning of the violence that comes over that TV set. And I used to say, you can watch Disney Channel. I watch Disney Channel. And I said, well, let's watch the news. That didn't work. So now we talk. Kevin touched on this thing that it has to go back much further. And I think within this whole conference, with the energy that you see here, we're all in a state of frustration. I think of a couple of things. I think of tribal societies. Tribal societies had systems that at one time, women, for some tribes, were property. They had no rights. They belonged to the man. Women in other tribes were power. Matrilocal tribes, the line of descendancy came through the woman. That's the kind of tribe I'm from. The women are power. And at one time, a man, yes, he had a right to beat his wife. But he didn't if he wanted to be socially acceptable. Because to be acceptable within the community, to be recognized as a quote-unquote good man, you did not beat your wife. If you did beat your wife, you were not acceptable. In other words, it was the power of the social order, the community, that says that's not acceptable and you're not a good man. If that's your total existence, your little social society, social order, and your existence depends on people thinking of you as a good man or the perception they have of you, you do not beat somebody. But if you have a society that's dominated by a male, good old boy attitude, i.e., the last appointment of the Supreme Court judge, the ensuing investigation, you're going to have to change that system. If you don't take the good old boy out of the government, because for Indians now, we have evolved from that close society of being responsible to everyone around us. They have assimilated us in many ways, and we're just as bad as everybody else. Yeah, we're healing. All those things that make batters, by the way, alcoholism, poor feelings about yourself, thoughts. We've had those type of emotions instituted through federal policy on us. So we've become experts. And I always think of the way people look at themselves, the way women look at themselves. I'm no damn good, so it's all right if he beats up on me. I can think of a student I have that comes to me and says, I said, why do you put up with this? And she said, because he needs me. And from her heart, he is the only one that needs her. And for that reason, she'll put up with what happens to her. That self-evaluation is something that's been conditioned into us. And when it comes to alcohol, no sense of talking about that. Unfortunately, everyone has this concept that all Indians are drunks. Most of us were at one time or another. But it's coming out of that now. It's changing. It's just like all things. We're starting back at the beginning and changing. The larger society has to do the same thing. How do you do it? Well, my commentary is going to stretch over to both Susan and the professor, which I think is great because one of the finest, I'm a great admirer of Angie Debo, who was a historian the best. She was just 60 years early. Doctorate. Could never teach history because she was a woman, and women can't teach history, you know that. See, I can say that, and the doors are back there. I'll probably never get to them. But it's the concept, that's the very thing you look at when we deal. So I would offer something that covers all of this. You want to change something, and you're all here sitting as individuals, and I'll offer you this. You heard it last night. Don't you say nothing. Where's she at? Where is the lady that always browbeats me? Oh, there she is. See, when they know they do it, they're not bashful. We have to create something, and it's within tribal system. We've had it a long time. You ever seen a driftwood lodge? A driftwood lodge is when you look in the river and you see all these pieces of wood that have bashed themselves together. And in that, as they travel that river, which is life, they pound against each other and get tighter and tighter and stronger. Every now and then they'll hit a bad bump and one of them will fly out. And usually that one that comes out will go over and it'll get in a little whirlpool or a little eddy. And they'll stay there all their life, never going forward, never going backward, just simply wallowing in one place. But the group that stays as the Driftwood Lodge will move down the river till it finally stops, gets bigger, gets stronger, and then the river, life itself, will move around it and go on. That security of being together, not individuals, but if you have a common cause, do this. Become a Driftwood Lodge. Not just in words, but share every little bit you have with each other and take it from everybody. And above all things, don't get sucked up in pity, because it gets in your way. And what you have to do is much more important. The potential of the destruction that this battering system has, frankly, is our own creation, simply by this society. But you can change that if you become the Driftwood Lodge. Don't lose who you are individually, but make one of those sticks the material that Kevin makes one of those sticks the experience of Susan. Make another stick of it the experience of the lawyer. Don't leave out anything. Then, and start to change from the beginning. You won't live to see it, but that's not important. What is important at some time on the face of this earth, that the human, man, woman, child, regardless, does not have to stand in fear of being abused or brutalized. That's my commentary. Thank you.